All right, buddy. It's time to pick a face.
Like Mike.
You got good taste.
We have $2 billion tied up in this program. Solo's the perfect soldier. No one will cry when Solo is gone. We'll simply build another one.
A long time ago, in a galaxy far, far away, a great adventure took place.
Talking Bird, a special edition.
I'm your host, Robert Zachary, along with my co-host, John Llewellyn. How's it going, John?
Doing all right.
Just
a momentous occasion.
Momentous occasion. If you
full of mixed emotions right now.
Yes, a lot of mixed emotion. If this is your first episode of Talking Bird, the special edition, I have to just preload this by apologizing because this is the last episode of Talking Bird, the special edition.
Yeah.
Which I have a habit of jumping into things like right when they stop happening.
Mm-hmm.
You feel like I love this thing, and all of a sudden like, oh, this show's got canceled or this show's going away. So I commiserate with you, but you do have 90 some odd episodes in the back. You can relive the neophyte observations of, I don't know. I guess we started after we didn't start after did we start around the first teaser or right after the first teaser, but
let's
not
see. So show number 1
was in April of
2015.
Yes.
So we have the second teaser trailer for episode 7. They announced Rogue One at Star Wars Celebration just prior to that. And that was the big news. So they had kind of just started announcing content, or, you know, they had already had this The Force Awakens sort of in the works, and then they announced Rogue One. And here we are more than 2 years later, and those are still the only movies they've made.
Yeah, that's true.
Or at least that they've released.
Yeah. So, I mean, I guess my point is that you can go back, and if I don't know why anybody would do this, but more power to you if you do. I appreciate it. But go back and like listen to the thing. I bet you anything I contradict myself like 500 times on all these episodes. It'd be like 1 week I'm like, Star Wars is done for. Next week, Star Wars is back.
Yeah.
I'm pretty sure that, like, you know, it's just going to be a long list of changing opinions or repeated ideas, but, you know, whatever. And if you
I'm sure I've repeated myself like every other episode. So
yeah, that's what happens when I make a thing not to edit the show excessively. Because I kind of hated it when you listen to podcasts and you can hear the click every time. It's like mid sentence. It's like, oh my God, they're down to editing out like fragments and things. It's like, ugh. Yeah. Anyway, but like I said, we went through all this last week and we thought we'd do one more spin through because there is tons of news and things on the horizon, and we have opinions about that. So we'd be remiss if we didn't go once more into the breach and talk about all things happening. That sounds really awkward. All things happening Star Wars. Oh wow.
Yeah.
Hey, at least I didn't do my original plan. It's like I was just gonna show up here drunk and be like, but I'm like, it's 1:00 in the afternoon. I'm not gonna do that. It just didn't make sense when it came to it. So, unfortunately, I can't blame anything on the booze. It's just me talking. So,
blame it on the boozy.
Blame it on the boozy. So what? Where should we start with this? We've got the rundown. We got the introduction. Do we need to do more introductioning? Do we want to just?
No, I think we've introduced ourselves. We've plenty of times over the last 2+ years. 27 months to 28 months. So we are going to talk about some big picture stuff because this is kind of our last run at this. But we have some news, some recent movie specific news. I don't even know if you'd categorize this as a rumor or a leak or what, but someone on Reddit came across a Star Wars toy catalog. I am going to forever pride myself on never visiting Reddit. So I'm not going to go down the rabbit hole where specifically this came from.
Good for you.
But the Star Wars toy catalog, someone took a photo of it because it contains an image of, the Star Wars film logo that we all know and love, the title of the movie and with Star Wars on either side. You know what the titles of the Star Wars movies look like. So it's that, but it's for the Han Solo movie, and it is called, at least this logo says it is called, imaginatively enough, Han Solo: A Star Wars Story. So that is potentially officially, it's certainly official looking as the name of the Han Solo movie. It is basically a half step up from just calling it the Han Solo movie. How do you, I don't know, do you have any feelings about this at all? I find myself looking at this and go like, yeah, I mean, that, even if, because it, we'd seen, I guess, some like crew hats or jackets or something that just said Solo on them. And so it was like, oh, maybe they just call it Solo, and that it's not the boldest choice in the world, but it's still something slightly different, whereas this is certainly not the boldest choice in the world. But even then, it's not that different from just calling it Solo. So yeah, there is potentially your title.
Yeah, I mean, I think that I'm sure that initially they were probably going to go with Solo, but then they probably realized they didn't need the lawsuit from Mario Van Peebles for his 90s Terminator ripoff movie called Solo. Have you seen that? Ever seen that ad?
No.
Oh yeah, it's great.
I have not.
It's like Mario Van Peebles, I'm not so super intimately familiar with every aspect of Mario Van Peebles' career, but I think it was kind of the near the end of his action being kind of an action guy, and he there's this whole thing about him picking out his face and all this stuff, and he just goes, it's like, what kind of face do you want to have, or what kind of hairstyle you want? I don't remember. This is just picking up on this. He looks at it, he goes, like Mike. And then they give him a Michael Jordan, he's supposed to look like Michael Jordan, but Mario Van Peebles doesn't really look like Michael Jordan.
No, not at all.
He just has a bald head. And so it's like one of those things where it's like a killer robot escapes from the lab and figures out what it means to be human. I think that's the whole point. And it's called Solo or something. So I assume that Mario Van Peebles would just, would be immediately suing him, but no, I'm just kidding. The whole point is that they've had so many ups and downs with this movie. I think going with some kind of goofy title, which the A Star Wars Story is kind of goofy to start with, but I did think that they kind of said that they weren't going to say that anymore, or was it the word anthology that they weren't going to use?
Yeah, I think they moved away from anthology.
Okay. Yeah.
With Rogue One, initially it was going to be, Star Wars Anthology : Rogue One or something like that, and then they decided, well, we're going to call these all, a Star Wars story. I mean, that's the part that I'm if they're including that, like, yeah, it makes sense for cohesion, but is every one of these movies going to have a Star Wars story attached to it? And
Well, yeah.
that just seems unwieldy after a while.
Well, I think it's it's probably the marketing department is saying, like, we are, you can't do a movie and just call it Han Solo without adding something. I mean, I think it's fair
without putting the word Star Wars in there.
Right. And I think that, now that, and we'll get to it later, that they're starting to theorize that there's going to be even more of these. If they're kind of locked into this thing where they're going to go, Boba Fett, Jabba the Hutt, they can't just they have to frame it some ways because, they can't fund these movies off of, repeat viewing from Star Wars fans. They have to cross into popular culture. They have to let the customer, the viewer, know what they're getting into. So it's like, for people that are, dyed in the wool Star Wars fans, it seems absurd to be like, well, why wouldn't you know who these people are? But I can't imagine how confusing it was for people going to see Rogue One that weren't really Star Wars fans. It's just like, what, Rogue One, what does that mean? What is that? But framing it with a Star Wars story, it just kind of like, all right. The problem is it doesn't roll off the tongue. It's not like a sonorous way of having a movie title. It definitely goes away from George's original idea of a Saturday morning serial concept with, kind of loaded with emotion, loaded with wonder. People are like, even now, as much as I don't know if Last Jedi has been a controversial title more so than it's just kind of set the internet afire with, like, is it Last Jedi? Is Jedi singular? Is Jedi, plural? What does that mean? That kind of thing. That's what a proper Star Wars title should do. Unfortunately, I feel like going forward, they're going to have, I don't think brand confusion or whatever. They're going to have to almost separate these kind of anthology or one-off movies. They're going to have to maybe not to have that nice artistic flourish, which is, it's a sad concession, but I can't imagine what you would call a Han Solo movie. It's like, they could be cheeky, they could be obscure, but when you already are probably spending $300 million on a movie, because I'm assuming it was a $200 million movie, and then adding Ron Howard's reshoots is probably another $100 million. The brand confusion is not something you want to have to deal with. Be like, oh, we fixed it, but now nobody knows what it is because we call it like coming to grips, or the Kessel maneuver, or whatever,
the fastest hunk of junk in the galaxy.
Exactly. And then people would
they should have made a title like, Mother Jugs and Speed, or like Smokey the Bear, one of those like 1970s like trucker movies or like hippie road movies where it's this like super long title and it includes the fastest hunk of junk in the galaxy.
Yeah, it'd be like
at the end of it. That would have been fun.
It'd be like that movie Convoy with or Cannonball Run or whatever. But yeah, it would be kind of fun if there was kind of an aesthetic like a 70s, custom van kind of life.
Yeah, that would have been, oh man, that would have been so good.
Dune buggies and girls at the beach and that, but that we're probably not. I think that maybe that Lord and Miller maybe tried that and it didn't go down too well in the pantheon of Disney. I don't know, but I think they're gonna, I think they don't want to have any kind of concept of humor. I bet you anything that when the eventual teasers and trailers come out, they'll probably be very light on the humor just because of people's, expressing a great amount of unease about the Han Solo movie being a potential like comedy or something, which I don't know. Some people were okay with it. Some people, I'd say the vast majority were against that idea. So I think we're hitting peak safety when it comes to naming things in Star Wars. It'll be really interesting, like what the episode 9 eventually gets called, because they have their own kind of issues that they're backing up against, and they haven't even rolled camera on it yet. So I think it's just, you know, and Han Solo, people like internationally, it's like they're gonna, if they're, at least if they have a certain, you know, alacrity or whatever with Star Wars, they'll be okay, Han Solo, but then again they'll have the Star Wars, so if they're sending it out to, you know, China or whatever, they're like, okay, this is a Star Wars film, you know. So I think in some ways I kind of understand why they're sticking with this naming concession, even though again it's not a lot of fun.
I don't know why I hadn't thought of this, but as you say, you know, they're doing reshoots on this Han Solo movie, and given everything that transpired, and you know, they probably have to invest a lot more money in reshoots for this one than they did for, say, even with Rogue One, I would imagine. So, you know, they kind of have even more writing on this Han Solo movie than I thought. And yeah, so the incentive just isn't there for them to go out on a limb with this one. And as we're seeing, they're really not in the mindset of going out on the limb at present. Maybe that happens in the future, but yeah, I think it's the safest title they could have chosen. That doesn't mean it's a bad title or the worst option out there, but it is the safest option.
Well, and the best example of even within in-house, if I'm bringing this up again, is of course I think 2012's John Carter, which
right.
I went and looked because I don't know why I was reading this the other night, but it's just like the highest budgeted films in history or whatever. And, you know, 3 or 4 of them were Disney productions, and most of them were flops. You know, say like the 4th Pirates of the Caribbean movie, not the one that just came out that flopped, but the one before it that kind of flopped. And it was a $345 million film. And that's probably just the negative cost, meaning that's how much it cost to physically make it, not the marketing that they had to, you know, add to that. And again, John Carter had a major problem because the original text was called John Carter of Mars, or Princess of Mars. I'm sorry. It was called Princess of Mars. And so that doesn't make sense. It's not a prince movie about princesses. Well, let's call it John Carter of Mars. And then they got this thing where it's like, oh, that's going to be confusing. So they just took off the Mars part and put John Carter, and people are like, what is this? This is like Remo Williams with, you know, Fred Ward, where they're just trying to like shoehorn in some made up action hero. And it's like, yeah, it was disastrous because they took a 70-year-old and 80-year-old property and spent no time at all trying to instill this idea of what it is for people. So, you know, I think that they've learned from their mistakes, so they're going to have, you know, it's going to have to say very obvious what it is. Does that make sense?
Yeah. And yeah, it's just, we'll get into this, but it is, as you say, it's just, we need to make sure everyone is very clear on what this is, and we need to make sure that everyone's on board and that we're making these movies in a way that, you know, has an audience already. And that's true of a lot of movies, right? A movie in search of an audience is kind of I don't know if that exact wording, but you know, that there's sort of a term like that within the movie business for a movie that doesn't do well, is that like, well, it just couldn't find its audience.
Right.
And that's absolutely a scenario that no one wants. You know, Star Wars, you would think, has less of that problem just because there's already a built-in fan base for Star Wars. And as soon as you say like, oh, this is a Star Wars movie, then great, we've got that fan base and we can maybe rely on word of mouth and all that. But yeah, it certainly seems like they are trying to avoid that, oh, well, it just couldn't find its audience scenario at all costs, basically.
Yeah, I mean, I think that there's always that potential because, you know, Star Wars as a franchise is kind of, I won't say they're not in uncharted waters, but my point is that never in the history of Lucasfilm have they kind of, you know, muddied the water as far as the importance of their own films. And my point being is that, they promote the video games almost like the movies. They promote, they really push the comics. They push the Rebels cartoon. They push a lot of interstitial material. Maybe not at the same level as a movie. Don't get me wrong. It's not like they're doing huge campaigns for Rebels or whatever. But for identification, they are kind of muddying the water in the sense that there's so much Star Wars in different formats out there. There is always the potential that when something comes out where they're like, well, is this like a TV special? Is this, straight to video? Is this a movie? So they always have to keep this, idea of like, again, I've always felt that like the old G level canon or the movie level canon, I always felt that was the easiest way. It's kind of like by the time you get down to the video games, it's like, okay, yeah, if the story fits, that's cool, but if it contradicts it a little bit, just default back to the films, because that's where that's the timeline that we're keeping track of,
Right.
But
yeah.
Now it's people kind of get bent out of shape about stuff because everything is like they're, even though in the past they've always said, oh, this is canon, Racers, PS2 Pod Racers Revenge is canon, but they never really made a lot of overtures except when somebody would write into like Star Wars magazine and go, is this canon? They're like, yes. Now that there's Twitter and stuff and you can get, the story group guy, on a Friday night just starts to unload about his feelings about canon, people start to go like, well, is this official? Is this his official way of doing it? Or is this just him kind of pontificating? It just gets muddied in that thing where it's like, well, do I need to consume all of this to get the story? Which,
right.
Most people would say, well, I just go see the movie, but it is getting to be more and more with all kinds of films, not just Star Wars movies, where it's like they're trying to break the barrier of the theater to home. And I remember that really awful like found footage Exorcist ripoff movie came out 2 or 3 years ago called like Evil Inside or something like that. It was Well, so I watched it. I can't remember why I watched it. Either I got it from Netflix or it was on one of these streaming services. And I was like, whatever, I'll watch it. I'll watch a horror movie. And at the end, there's no ending. You have to go to a website to see the ending of the movie. And I'm just like,
that's terrible.
I'm not saying that they would ever do that with a Star Wars film. But my point is the more and more this idea that you have to consume more and more ancillary material to get your fix, it kind of seems like marketeers are getting more and more like comfortable with asking that. And it's getting to be more and more like the potential of, walking out of the theater and being like, why did C-3PO have a red arm? Well, that comic will be coming out. And it's like,
right.
Not that you had to know where that red arm came from, but wait till they have something where it's like some character shows up and everybody knows this character and they never explain where they come from. And then you're confused the whole time. And they're like, well, there's actually a short animated video that's going to be on StarWars.com, and you need to watch that to know who that character is. See, now that would be a problem. I'm not saying that they're doing that for sure. I'm just saying, I bet you there's somebody in marketing that's like tempted to be like, hey, we could boost, people watching our animated properties by this percentage if we just, kind of made it this less evident, or, not that I've heard any rumors of the sort. I'm just thinking of the way that, movies are getting marketed now, where it's like,
right.
They want to funnel people to the ancillary materials, especially now when it's like, there's so much, it's so much easier to produce even than say a movie. And it's like, it's like they're not happy with the writer on some comic. They just dump them and bring somebody else in. It's not like, a major thing where we have to do, 2 months of reshoots or whatever, like the Han Solo movie.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, now that kind of like extra, like multimedia content stuff, usually the movies or books or whatever that do that kind of stuff are pretty awful. Like I can't recall a good movie that's done anything like that, where like, oh, to see the ending of this movie, go to www.
Right.
thesecretofhappiness.com or whatever. or whatever. Is that the name of that movie? I don't know.
I don't know, but I mean, yeah, I mean, I guess the only thing I would say kind of pushes it in this realm with Disney, and they haven't done this with a Star Wars movie, and I kind of knock on wood that they don't start doing this, is this after credits thing.
Yeah.
And that's kind of
I'm done with that.
That's the kind of the taster that they do now, and I'm like, yeah, when I go see a Marvel movie, which to be perfectly frank, I hasn't been in the last 2 years because I'm just kind of like, I'll just wait for them out on video. Is that I'd just get up and leave because I'm like, I don't really care. But that's the way that's where we're all kind of set up. I could tell a story about this concert I went to, and I'll tell it briefly, but I was so convinced that they were going to do an encore that I ended up spending 20 minutes waiting in a stadium because they were out there like saying, "Hey man, we love you guys. We love you guys. It was so great." I'm thinking, of course they're going to run back in with their guitars and do one more track or one more song, and it's like, no. All of a sudden the house lights came up, and I'm like, I've been here for 20 minutes thinking you guys were going to do an encore, and you were just coming out for applause. It's like, no thanks. But I guess that's like, it's all about timing. It's like, once the movie's over, I want to leave. I don't want to potentially get jammed up in a exit because somebody's like runs back and like, I don't see it. It's Thanos. They're going to show Thanos for 20 seconds. And I just really hope that they never do that. I mean, the only time they ever did anything like that was at the end of The Phantom Menace. At the very end, I think they did a Vader subtly doing an inhale, exhale as a sound effect.
Yeah, and that was sort of part of the John Williams score.
Oh, really? I
can't remember if... because for The Phantom Menace... he wrote Anakin's theme, which was Vader's theme, kind of, transposed in different ways, backwards and upside down and all that kind of stuff. And so, it kind of, but it still has it still ends in that dun da da dun da da, from the Imperial March. So it was kind of there, and so they may have just wanted to accentuate that. But yeah, that wasn't part of the score. I don't think John Williams wrote you should put in the sound effect there. But it was at least wasn't completely out of the blue for them to put it there.
Right.
It was cheesy, especially after sitting through that movie, and then you get to that and you're like, oh, come on. Right? Don't. It just felt like insulting your intelligence.
Yeah, I mean, it definitely entered a sense of dread of this is the way. So I guess in some ways I can't really take Disney to task for this kind of experimentation because really George was kind of invented it. You know what I mean? At least with the prequels.
Right.
A lot of Labyrinth of Evil or The Approaching Storm, these books that you were supposed to read, and I think there was one that was between Phantom Menace and written by Greg Bear, where it was literally marketed as the first time that Anakin has to take a life, and you're just like, ugh. It's like, what the heck is that? Is that what you're really gonna sell this? It was kind of a weird book, but yeah, it's funny to think that they would ever have a problem kind of confusing the consumer about Star Wars, but I honestly feel like it could be a real potential if they don't keep their eye on the ball, or they try to boost some of their non-movie ancillary material by trying to tell fans that it's way more important than it really is. Because I never felt any of those books, in retrospect, were ever I ever walked into the movie theater. Maybe there had been something in between the what is it, the Approaching Storm. I think there's a Gundark thing. I can't remember, because then there's that joke we fell into that nest of Gundarks, and I'm like, well, yeah, I just read about that. It was like a thing. They literally fell into a nest and then they cut their way out. It was it wasn't really oh, I understand the movie so much better. It's not. I didn't walk out of Attack of the Clones kind of going well, if you understood the movie like I did, you would not realize that it was pretty lame or something. No, it was just kind of turned out to be somewhat of a lame story. So, excuse me.
Yeah.
But
so speaking of the Han Solo movie,
yes.
the title is out. Also out of the Han Solo movie is the actor Michael K. Williams, who he was on The Wire. He was in that, I guess it was a mini series called The Night of, um, with Riz Ahmed. Anyway, he was in the Han Solo movie. He he completely shot all of his scenes. He, like many actors, he has multiple commitments in a year, so he went to film another movie. And then, of course, they fired Lord and Miller. They hired Ron Howard, who now has to do all these reshoots. And so the reshoot schedule is probably going longer than expected. And because they are, depending on who you talk to, I guess Ron Howard and Larry Kasdan would say they are going back to the original script. They need to reshoot some scenes that Michael K. Williams was in order to fit the story better. But he is no longer available because the revised production schedules clashes with these other commitments he made to work on other projects. So because of that, I guess they couldn't use any of his previous scenes anymore. And so he's just out of the movie entirely. He this came up in an interview he did. I can't remember with whom, but he didn't seem to have any hard feelings about it. He just kind of recognized, like, look, I have a schedule. I have other commitments. Their schedule changed. I couldn't do it. That's just how this business works. And so some specific quotes are, he says, quote, "I felt great about what I created with the directors that I worked with. It is what it is. We created a kick-ass character, in my opinion, and I'm proud of it." So what is that kick-ass character, you ask? Well, he's it was not specifically described, but it was described as some kind of half human, half animal. Vanity Fair picked up the story, and they have a little more details about his costume. And they say he wore this beautiful white kimono. It was very regal. He had class, money, strength, and charisma, and he knew how to fight. This is Michael K. Williams talking. He says, he was a warrior. He had a lot of prestige. If he lived in our world, he would probably hang out with Jay-Z and Beyonce, which, okay. And then Michael K. Williams basically said, like, hey, I had a lot of fun working with the Star Wars folks. Hopefully they enjoyed what I did. So he basically suggested he would be willing to be in another Star Wars movie in the future, say, hey, don't lose my number. Hopefully you liked enough of what you saw that you would be willing to hire me again in the future. So yeah, I mean, it was certainly highly probable that something like this might happen given what occurred with this production. I guess it's unfortunate, but we'll see what happens. I mean, if they could really just discard his character without losing any of the story, I mean, maybe they'll have to rewrite some scenes now. But if it really was to that extent where, like, if he couldn't do the reshoots, then they felt comfortable just cutting him out entirely, then maybe you think, like, well, maybe his character wasn't really that essential to begin with, and his scenes would have felt extraneous. But how do you feel about this, Robert?
Well, I mean, I obviously am a fan. Well, I'm really only familiar with him on Boardwalk Empire and The Wire. He's definitely shown up in a lot of other movies, but it's kind of like, yeah, it totally makes me think from just the way he's talking and just the kind of, this was a relatively small role. It probably may have, had a sequence. It might have been a part of a sequence that he wasn't even essential to. So, because it's like, we don't hear about, I don't know if, and maybe this is just protocol, but they didn't talk about a recasting situation. So there might be a good chance that they might have just 86 the part altogether, but they said to him, like, oh, it's a scheduling issue, kind of thing, rather than saying, like, yeah, because they did say he was just kind of, originally the story broke says he was cut out. It's like his scene, basically it was like initially they had said, oh, his scenes didn't really mesh with the story. And then later they kind of added this thing like, oh, it was a scheduling issue. And so maybe it was because they didn't want to imply that maybe, oh, his performance wasn't up to the Ron Howard's things, because I don't think that's what it was. I just think the character itself isn't important to the story anymore. And it's, you know, this might have been like a 2-3 minute thing, or maybe it was much larger. He obviously interacted with what's her face. Oh God, I'm blanking on it.
Emilia Clarke,
because he knew her name, her character's name, and they talked about that. So he must have interacted with her.
Kira, which is a very, very common name in Star Wars, apparently.
My point is that, like, I had this whole idea about, like, not an idea, but criticism again about the naming schemes of some of these characters. They've become very bland over this. I mean, I like Jyn Erso and Cassian Andor. That, to me, those sounds like Star Wars names, but like Kira and what is the other one? What's another new character? I was kind of like, oh, like Rose. You know, it's like Rose. Really, is like, right. Are there flowers named Rose? I mean, maybe it'll make more sense as time goes on. I know that at one point, apparently, I think Rose was a placeholder name for Rey at some point.
It was
in the early thing. So maybe there's a significance to Lucasfilm that I'm completely missing on. I mean, in the end of the day, it doesn't really matter what the name. It's just like, you know, it used to be like these goofy Star Wars name generators, like, you know, here's your it's the street you grew up on and the first place you ever bought PVC piping at or something. You know, I don't know. It's just like Kira. I mean, again, I know I'm probably the only person that ever would even think about this, but there's a character in those Vin Diesel Riddick movies named Kira, and so it's kind of like, oh, there's already like a sci-fi movie with a Kira in it, but whatever. It doesn't really matter. It's not like people are like, I can't believe you ripped off the Chronicles of Riddick. But you know, It's like there's so many names you could have. Come up with something that, like, I might not actually, you know, I might not run into it, you know, in a baby naming book or whatever. Like, come up with some cool, like, new Star Wars names. Like, you're making the names for the next 20 years. Like, yes, you know, Leia is a real name, and obviously Luke is a name that we've known many Lukes, you know, over the years. But, you know, when you come up with it's supposed to be fun, and like, come up with something exciting, something a little different, something that, like, you know, okay, there was the Jyn Erso, which people had, like, you know, Jyn Arsehole or whatever, they were making these jokes, but those died off pretty quick, and it kind of integrated into the tapestry of Star Wars quite quickly. But I don't know. Of course,
for me, and I knew Kira was kind of the original one. So when they started developing The Force Awakens, there was a male and a female character who were dramatically different than what those characters ended up being. They became Rey and Finn, I guess. But the male character was like the main, you know, hero character, and Kira was not.
Yeah, I think his name was Sam, wasn't it, or something like that?
Yeah. That's right.
Which is so bland.
But hearing Kira makes me think of the Unfrozen Caveman lawyer sketches from Saturday Night Live, because his name was Keyrock. And like in every sketch at one point, you know, the judge would say, like, Mr. Keyrock, are you ready to proceed? And he would just go, it's just Keyrock, Your Honor. And yes, I am. And so, like, whenever I hear Kira, like, it's just Kira, Your Honor. And yes. So that's how Kira sticks in my mind.
Yes, and that's when you do like these things that sometimes, you know, I think they should hire people to, like, go and say, like, well, again, another SNL skit where it's like Nicolas Cage trying to choose a baby name with his wife, and he just every time he can come up with 50 different ways you could put a kid down with that name. That's kind of what they need to hire at the end. It's like, nah, let's not name. Not that. I mean, I would just say Kira's kind of bland, but that's not really saying, like, oh, that's a slang for taking a dump behind a shed or something. You know, it's not.
Our devoted listener, actress Kira Sedgwick, is not happy with you right now.
Well, she spells that with a Y.
That's true. Yeah.
You know, don't worry, man.
And I guess there's Kiri Hart, who is on the Lucasfilm Story Group, which is Kiri, and that is a little more unique, I guess, but maybe it's related to her somehow. I don't know.
I guess so.
But yeah, so right, so he just dropped. Oh, Emilia Clarke's character. So he had an interaction with Emilia Clarke's character, but clearly it wasn't important enough that they couldn't just write around it. So that's the story of Michael K. Williams in Han Solo: a Star Wars story. The last kind of specific piece of news that I wanted to touch on was 2 new vehicles from The Last Jedi, which one of them we had kind of heard about. We'd probably heard about both of them. So the first is a while back we had heard tell of, the Last Jedi's version of the AT-AT, except this one kind of moved like a gorilla, like it kind of moved on the knuckles, I guess, of its front legs in some fashion. And so we got more detail about that yesterday. They revealed these on the Star Wars show, the Lucasfilm YouTube series. So this is called the ATM-6 Walker, which stands for All Terrain Mega Caliber 6. And it is called that because it has a Mega Caliber 6 laser cannon on its back. And so it moves more simian-like because then it can just, like, I guess, duck down and let the laser cannon shoot stuff. I mean, in some ways that sounds, in the prequels and in the Clone Wars show, the kind of one of the proto AT-ATs had like one. I feel like it had like one laser on the back.
Yes. I can't.
One big laser on the back. So I think this is maybe bringing that full circle. Then is what it sounds like. The thing about the ATM-6 Walker to me is that the cockpit reminds me so much of a Cylon from the original Battlestar Galactica. And, Ralph McQuarrie did design work for both Star Wars and the original Battlestar Galactica TV show, which was the object of some controversy at the time. But given that they are kind of going back, or at least in The Force Awakens and in Rogue One, they tried to incorporate some original Ralph McQuarrie designs. Like, I wonder if they unearthed something somewhere that had like a Star Wars stamp on it that looked kind of like that, and they went, aha, success. I mean, certainly there are enough people in the design department who have seen the original Battlestar Galactica that someone either they just completely didn't see it or they saw it and went ahead with it anyway.
Yeah,
I don't know. Am I crazy though? Am I the only one who sees this?
I mean, there is a kind of feel.
I guess it's because there are these 2 like jowls that hang down below, and that's plus the cockpit window is just this one band across rather than the 2 eyes that were in the original AT-ATs, and so that's what looks like it to me anyway.
Yeah, I mean, I can't imagine that Lucasfilm is trying to. Well, I was going to bring up a picture, but I don't want to search for it. But I'm picturing it in my mind. Yeah, I mean, I understand what you're saying. It's kind of like, on one side, I can go like, oh well, they kind of solved the problem. It's kind of cool because they solved the problem that the kind of like the number one thing in the Star Wars lore is like they create these armored tanks and then they give them long spindly legs that can be tripped or knocked, incapacitated. Generally, it's like they even kind of retconned the armor plating in Empire and the fact that in the Rogue One, the bigger cargo ships, the X-wings were able to take them out relatively easy if they could get a good shot at the sideboards of these ships. So it's kind of like they retconned the idea, but by the time of Empire Strikes Back, the Empire had figured that out, and then they put armor plating. So it's almost like a nice kind of, if you were watching the movies in a kind of semi chronological order to the timeline of Star Wars, Rogue One, it's like this thing where like, oh, these are the things I remember these from Rogue One, they'll get rid of them quickly, and then you find out no, they've learned, and then now we're jumping ahead 30 plus years, they've the bad guys have learned again, and they've redesigned these things that like, oh, we're gonna take them out by sweeping their legs. Like, no, we can squat down actually, and not only that, we're actually more powerful when we kind of when these things get on their haunches. They can stabilize, a cannon. It's kind of an interesting bit of engineering. But yes, the aesthetic is kind of evocative of Battlestar Galactica, in which is kind of hilarious because it's like, that was the whole thing they said about going forward with Star Wars, that they were like, well, it's been 30 years. We need to, our designs will change over time. Well, now they've it's like that thing where it's like, I would say, as far as at least for pop culture in this country, in America, we're on a 30-year cycle. We keep looping back with aesthetics because now it's like, in some ways that's what it's like. Okay, now in some ways this stuff is evocative of the 70s. So it's our 40-year cycle or whatever. So it is an interesting thing. I mean, I kind of like it, although I'm kind of waiting to see how it's used. But again, it does kind of fall into this idea that, that Rian Johnson's been very testy about in the last couple months, that there are going to be very definitive nods to Empire in this movie, and the fact that, like, oh, there's going to be a big ground battle, versus walkers, and there's going to be kind of a shuttle-y thing, like a fast-moving speeder, and it's like, okay. Now, I know that a lot of times when it comes to Star Wars movies, the action sequences are plotted out and even prevised almost before the cameras start running because they have to take so long to make them.
Mm-hmm.
So it's, in some ways, these things are out of Rian Johnson's hands. He can't be like I don't, I want to do a Star Wars movie and I don't want to have any big battles in it, which is kind of like, it'd be antithetical to Star Wars not to have at least one big battle per film.
Which is interesting. We'll talk about that a little more coming up. But I mean, the other. Anyway, I agree. I like it overall, or I think it's interesting. I'm willing to see what it looks like in the movie, because right now it's just like a picture of the digital model, which you don't really get a lot of context out of. The other vehicle that was revealed is the First Order Dreadnought warship, which looks like a Star Destroyer, but flatter, kind of. And I think they have a couple of the, Imperial dreadnoughts that show up on Star Wars Rebels. So you could Google those and get an idea. But it basically, to me at least, looks like a Star Destroyer, but flatter. Within the universe, it is 25,000 feet long. It has 2 orbital cannons for, heavy-duty firepower. Again, suggesting that the First Order is attacking this planet. There's a ground assault of some kind. We in the teaser we did see Poe Dameron running towards this hangar, and then there was this explosion in the hangar. So we're putting together the pieces that perhaps the Resistance base comes under attack in some form or fashion. I mean, the Dreadnought, to me, it looks very plain, which I guess is fine. Like, on the one hand, I guess I should say it looks both very, very plain, but then also there's just too much little detail. Like, the detail's too fine. Like, it just seems like there's too much pixel stuff going on, and a little too much texture on it.
Yeah.
While also looking pretty basic and plain. But that's me.
Yeah, I mean, aesthetically, I consider this Dreadnought thing to be a complete missed opportunity to do something new and inventive. Because it's like the Guerrilla Walkers. It's like there's enough of the old style, and it's pushing forward. It's kind of exciting. But with this Dreadnought, it's like they just made it bigger. It kind of looks like something a 5th grader would draw on a piece of paper, like for fun with a ruler. It's just like, yeah, it's like a big wedge, and it's got a big cannon on the bottom, and it's just kind of like, it's
like a Star Destroyer, but it has big guns on it.
Yeah, and again, it's that problem of like, well, we're not remaking Empire. Well, what was the big thing in Empire when there was this almost like luxuriating scene where you start to realize that there's bigger ships than the Star Destroyers.
The Super Star Destroyers.
They're all being dwarfed by this, thing. And it's like, it took many years for people to get into this idea, like, well, how many people would it take to man something like that? Which I understand. There is a certain kind of people, certain fan that enjoys the numbers of Star Wars. So it's the same people that famously,
it's a Mark 8 class. All that good.
But even they have to concede that like bigger is not always better with these things. It's like, well, they just kind of made it ugly. It kind of like in some ways,
right? When
they redefined when the Executor or whatever I think it was called was made, it was like, it was kind of, it was like a way of keeping the looming of the Death Star there. Kind of like, it was like the ghost of the Death Star in some ways, of like this massive thing and with this untapped potential. Now it was never quite utilized. It was kind of like watching a person run errands around town in an RV kind of thing. Like it never really, it never had any special weapons. It never really had any special function. It was just big and it dwarfed everything else. And it was kind of like, okay, and I feel like a little bit like what this new Dreadnought is kind of, it's got, the gun is obviously there to shoot at some point in the movie. That's going to happen. And they just wanted to make something really big. I mean, I never really, and there's something about the design that I just don't enjoy. And it falls under the same way I never enjoyed the way that they decided to redesign the Star Destroyers or whatever they call them in the First Order and the Force Awakens. It was just like, oh, well, we have this kind of taco chip shape. Let's just kind of like, we can never go off of that. It always has to be kind of like an arrowhead or a wedge or something. Like we can never, like, well, okay, we'll stack 2 conning towers on it. It's like, okay, well, let's put a gun on it. It was like, you could have anything. It could look like a monolith. It could look like it could look like a ball, but then it could be too much like, I guess it couldn't be a cube because of the Borg. But I mean, it could be a ship that, breaks into 3 ships or something, It's kind of, I'm kind of disappointed that they couldn't have come up with something like visually stunning. Now, this is just my take. Maybe they're kind of, maybe they know a reason, because there are certain aesthetics that work better for special effects and for battles, and they're like, well, we can't have something that looks like, a rhombus, or it's like it just doesn't work in camera or something. And so maybe there are aesthetic reasons or practical reasons why. Like we've found that for the way we're doing these movies, if we keep everything either in these kind of geometric shapes, it works better, and that there is a limitation. But it's kind of like even something like the Interdictor Cruiser, which is kind of like a which was on Rebels for people who aren't aware. And the whole point of those, it's a ship that they introduced in the books that they drew out into the cartoon. It's a ship that basically makes it impossible for other ships to escape via hyperspace. But one of the cool things is that it was kind of like these almost, well, it was like these balls that were kind of set inside the body of the ship, so it differentiated itself from other ships. I mean, to me, it's like, and again, it just feels like they're just making it like, oh, it's the extreme version of it. Like, we just made it more extreme, and it's like, okay, because I showed it to my wife, who hasn't really kept up on the build up on this, except for when I talk about it. And she even said, well, that's just ugly. It just looks like a bigger Star Destroyer. And I'm kind of like, if a person who's not like entrenched in it, their first reaction is kind of like, it just looks like they something on steroids, then maybe, again, how it's used, like I said, the Executor, except for that money shot where it, dwarfs all the other ships, it's not heavily used except during the escape from Empire. So maybe it's just a thing where it's like, oh yeah, it's one ship out of 50 ships we're going to have in this movie. This is just the only thing we're comfortable showing you right now. It might not be, it might not factor that large into the movie anyway.
Yeah. I mean, so back when you said, this is like something a kid might draw, where they're like, oh, I just wanted to be like a Star Destroyer with big guns on it. That got me to thinking and looking up who actually is working in the art department on this movie, because I don't know know that we've talked about it.
Not really.
Right? We've talked about Michael Kaplan doing the costumes, and he also did the costumes for Rogue One, he did costumes for another one of the recent. I guess it was the Force Awakens, I think. So he's doing the lead costume designer on Last Jedi as well. But looking through the art department, at least the production designers and the art department that is listed on IMDb, I'm not really seeing anyone that has any experience working on Star Wars, right? And really, I was looking because I was like, I wonder what Doug Chiang is doing these days, because I know he's been helping out with the quote unquote the Amy Hennig game, doing kind of art and production design for them, but I didn't know if he was still working on movies for Lucasfilm, because he, I've mentioned this again, repeating myself all the time, but when the prequels came out, they had these little webisodes, and there was one about the design aesthetic for episode 1, and Doug Chiang was saying, when he saw Star Wars when he was a kid, he loved it, but there are also some things about the design of the film that he was like, that's not really what I care about or want to see. And so he went home and drew his own versions of these things, and so maybe that is true. Maybe that is true for the people who are working on this movie. It's not like they've had a ton of opportunities to work on Star Wars movies before now, but they're drawing from other blockbuster franchises in a way that I don't know helps Star Wars. So, for example, the lead production designer on The Last Jedi is a guy named Rick Heinrichs, who started out. He did work for the Coen brothers. He was the production designer on both Fargo and The Big Lebowski. I mean, he'd done other work before that, but as production designer specifically, he worked on those two Coen brothers movies. He's done a few things for Tim Burton, the Tim Burton's Planet of the Apes movies, and then his Dark Shadows movie. He was the production designer for the Ang Lee Hulk movie. He's been the production designer for a couple of Pirates of the Caribbean movie, and then he was the production designer for the first Captain America, movie that came out 5-6 years ago. You have the one person who worked on The Last Jedi, who also worked on what was it called? The Force Awakens. I think he doesn't have a position of authority. He's just in the art department. But the lead vehicle designer, has worked on other Marvel movies, Guardians of the Galaxy, one of the Thor movies, Avengers: Age of Ultron. He's done some James Bond movies, the recent James Bonds. Looking through all of these guys' credits, and they are all men, I will say that. The people working in the art department and the production design department for The Last Jedi, they have experience working on Tim Burton movies, on Marvel movies, Pirates of the Caribbean movies, Transformer movies, other similar kinds of blockbusters that aren't Star Wars, but they're still, obviously created in the image of let's, make these blockbusters like Star Wars. But so to bring those kind of aesthetics that they've developed there, and I'm not saying that they're not all Star Wars fans. If they are or if they aren't, I don't think that matters as much. And certainly Rian Johnson is, a huge fan, so he's gonna, be the final word on these things with his Star Wars fandom in mind. But it is to say that, they're coming to this movie based on here's maybe something in my head that didn't really work for this Transformers movie, but maybe it'll work here. Or, the look of it is being made by people who, making these Transformer movies or these other Marvel movies, rather than we've worked on the last 2 or 3 Star Wars movies. It's not the people who worked on The Force Awakens or Rogue One. And so maybe just their approach to design, the what's in their head when they're asked to come up with a new version of a First Order battleship or a new version of an AT-AT. What jumps to their mind is not necessarily the same as someone who maybe has this dossier of like, well, here's maybe what we worked on in Rogue One, and maybe we could adapt that and update it a little bit, and it would look different enough. So that is all to say, maybe just their creative approach to this is just, okay, how can we make this AT-AT look kind of like it came out of the Transformers movie? Honestly, that's all long and rambling, and I probably insulted fine production designers and art department folks that I didn't really mean to malign, but that is to say, when they're being tasked with coming up with hundreds of sketches for these things, just their frame of reference may just be different, and it may be more like every other movie that's in theaters now, and that is probably to Star Wars' detriment.
Yeah, it does kind of like, well, I mean, again, Star Wars is a victim of its own success in the fact that, it influences an entire cottage industry, but then in that great rush to come up with new concepts or evolve concepts, it's like, yeah, you're end up competing against yourself, because they can't afford to keep the concepts and then keep the people, because these people Doug Chiang, I'm trying to look and see what he's working on. Like you said, it's like he is not listed as being involved with the Last Jedi. And he's
been in the business long enough, and certainly his work on Star Wars or whatever else, he's probably made enough money that he can step back a little bit whenever he wants. That's not like no one's hiring him. It's probably like, yeah, he just decided he doesn't want to go through this every year.
He also might find that it's that situation where they might be not super hot on innovation. Maybe he's the guy saying like, well, I'm thinking we should do something different. And he goes, and I think we should do something much more closer to what is a slight change of what's pre-existing. And he's like, well, that's not interesting to me, because he started out, it's interesting to realize that he started out thinking that he could do it better than Ralph McQuarrie. And I think that in some ways, if you've got the, as they say, if you've got the goods, that is usually the impetus between the impetus for a very good career, and the fact that, right. Yes, there's people out there that go, I could do better than that. But then there's some people that go, hey, I can do better than that. And they literally go and they, in the estimation, they do it. They go out and they learn a skill. And I think it sounds like Doug's like one of those guys. But a guy like that maybe doesn't really want to, again, he's like probably made some bucks, and he probably thinks to himself, do I really want to have to redraw the AT-AT? And like, oh no, this one's different. This one's like got knuckles or something, It's like, right. Okay, but I want to, he kind of talked about, again, in the bonus material on Rogue One, which he was, because they needed to tap somebody that had an ease with Star Wars stuff, that he had talked about how many revisions they went through with the U-Wing, even though I would say that in some respects it's like, really, of all the things, and that's what you came up with. But, it's not a bad ship, don't get me wrong. It's not like, it doesn't stick out like a sore thumb, but it sounded like, he had something in his mind, and so he's not a guy who's just going to be interested in being like, oh well, we changed it a little bit. This one's got a new hat, because as you like to talk about.
We put a big gun on the top of it,
exactly,
or underneath it. So which is what both of these things essentially are. Yeah.
I mean, in some respects, this is good. It's a good thing, as long as Rian Johnson's bringing the story, and the actors are bringing a convincing stuff, and the characters are there. At the end of the day, you're going to be like, oh, whatever. I don't care. It was a big ship and they fought, and, but wasn't this awesome? So in some respects, it's like, if a Star Wars movie lives and dies by how good the assault vehicles look, then we we do have a problem, because now it's like Harrison Ford says, if they're looking at us, then then this movie's got more problems than we thought, kind of thing. It's like if they're really scrutinizing the ships, then obviously the story's not interesting enough. And let's hope that apparently Ryan Johnson's got something really, really good for us. At least that's what he keeps saying.
Yeah. So I should clarify. I don't know that Doug Chiang said he went home and thought he could do it better because he was like 8 or 9 or 12 or whatever. But I think he saw that movie and realized that like he just had a different style, or like, oh, I like ships that look like this. They should have looked like that, or like why didn't they look like this? And then kind of drew those as a way of like figuring out what kind of what his own style was, or like, oh, I want to see a Star Wars movie that with my style of artwork and design. But to your point, I do wonder if in this era where George Lucas is minimally involved, they have a question about how the Jedi work and they ask him and he was like, well, I always thought it was like this, and then they can ignore it or not.
Well, let me get back to that after you finish your point.
Okay. In all of these new movies, it ultimately comes down to the director who okays these designs, and he has to go with a gut feeling of, does this feel like Star Wars or not? Like that is one of the considerations. Is this design going too far afield where this just doesn't feel like Star Wars, and therefore the whole movie isn't going to feel cohesive? And I think George Lucas was much more willing, to just like not care about that question. Like I think that question is more problematic or is tormenting this successive crop of directors probably more than it ever did him, because he, as we saw with the prequels, he was perfectly willing to just scrap the previous look and say like, well, that was a different era both within the universe and for me. In this one, I consciously want more design, I want a more handcrafted look, I want more artistic styles. We're gonna make things look completely different, and we're gonna try to meld them with the previous style we established. But like the what are they called? The Naboo starfighters, right? There isn't really a precedent for that in the original trilogy. Maybe you could say the Cloud City, the Cloud Cars, sort of in that kind of like a sleeker, more rounded look. But a lot of that stuff there wasn't really a precedent for design-wise in the original trilogy. But George Lucas didn't really care about that. He didn't, for something to look like Star Wars or look like it fit within the Star Wars universe meant something different to him than I think it does the folks who are making these design decisions today. And I'll get into that a little bit with our broader discussion, but I think, because it's not your baby, right? Especially if you grew up as a fan like Ryan Johnson or J.J. Abrams or whomever, you want to, do it justice. You want to make sure you don't like break this multi-billion-dollar enterprise. And so, maybe the design decisions you make are going to be a little safer just because, there's a little more of that risk aversion there. That would be my guess with this as part of the story.
So, I was just going to jump back to something you said about, and it's kind of not germane to this, but since it crossed my mind the other day. So, I don't know where it came out that like apparently, Kathy Kennedy claims that George Lucas is generally not involved in Star Wars, but occasionally we call him on the phone to ask about Jedi matters. Do you think for one second that that's true? That they actually call him on the phone and go, George, we have a question about the Jedi?
I would say maybe. I think we'll find out. We haven't heard yet. We'll find out if he sees a cut of The Last Jedi, right? Like if Ryan Johnson showed it to him. Because so far, both J.J. Abrams and Ryan Johnson have shown him a cut of their movie just to kind of, kiss the ring in some ways. And so it could be that, if Ryan Johnson is kind of taking this in a slightly different direction, or talking about the Jedi and the Force in a slightly new way that is, let's say, more expansive than either the original trilogy or the prequels, then I could see a situation where, maybe they do, if he's in the neighborhood, or, Rian Johnson drops him an email or something and says like, hey, what do you think about doing this? And George Lucas is like, yeah, great. Or, no, that's not really what I had in mind, but I don't own it anymore. And so, whatever. For Rebels, because this last season, they did a lot, or they did some of that kind of expanding this idea of the Force and the Jedi and the Sith and all of that. Dave Filoni drew a lot, I think, on his experiences working with George Lucas on the Clone Wars. And, he has in his head, like, well, George would always talk about it in this way, or, George never thought about it in this way, even though the fans kind of assume it is. So, I think it's possible that he is kind of influencing it in some way, not any kind of like veto power, or, saying, yeah, don't do this, or no, I don't like that, or the Jedi can't do this, or the Jedi can only do this. Yeah, I don't think he's making those kinds of decisions, but they might run a few things by him periodically of like, hey, what if we say the Force is this thing? What do you think about that? And he'll go like, yeah, whatever. I think that's probably closer to it. And the question, though, for me is why Kathleen Kennedy would have that out there. And she must feel that in some ways some fans want to hear that, or it's reassuring, or that, it in some way helps the production and the reception of this movie for people to know that George Lucas is still sort of involved in some, even if she's exaggerating it or not, she must feel in some sense that like saying that and having that out there in print helps the promotion and reception of this movie, and that I think is interesting.
I mean, I agree with that last part. I actually take the opinion that that George Lucas has no quantifiable influence, or
he's with us in spirit.
Yes, exactly. I don't think they ever ask him anything anymore. I think that they did that I think they did it for The Force Awakens, because it was very important that, even though if you really read between the lines and his comments about that, he was not happy with The Force Awakens. He was
they got burned a little bit.
He got burned. He called Disney white slavers, and he said it's not the movie, and where's Luke, where's Darth Vader's grandkids, which was his original concept. So he kind of even now we know he was throwing shade on JJ even months before the movie was supposed to come out.
Yeah.
So, I think George has probably gone on to, he's got a museum to think about. I just don't think he cares anymore, because he knows that, one, they're not, anything he says for them is going to be the wrong thing, because he can't, if anything other than praise, that Disney's going to consider that to be problematic. And it's kind of like that same,
right.
And it's the sad thing is that it's definitely this is a different scenario than, say, Gene Roddenberry, because Gene Roddenberry was a part of Star Trek in a kind of sad way. The fact that they never officially gave him the boot. He just languished in an office on the Paramount lot where his ideas were kind of, thrown in the circular file, and he, his health declined. So there was that issue, but I honestly don't think George has much, probably doesn't have, they had him come see Rogue One, and apparently he enjoyed that a lot more, and probably because it didn't mess with his overall mythology as much, as it was very respectful of his mythology, and in a lot of ways it was very much influenced by the Lucas, and dare I compare them on the same level? Well, I'm not really, but the Filoni kind of shepherding of the Star Wars universe, because they didn't have to go, they had the prequel era and they had the galactic uprising era, and it didn't touch on anything post George selling off Star Wars. But I honestly feel that like yeah, okay, maybe she calls him on the phone and gives him a like, "Hi George, just want to let you know we're doing reshoots and stuff like that, and it's real exciting. I think Ryan's got a great thing. I think he's, and he'd probably just be like, oh yeah, well, when I wrote it, it was, the Jedi were, originally I didn't really have an idea, and then later on I thought they should be like monks." And then she's like, yeah, that's great, George. Anyway, are we getting together next month in Chicago? And it's like, yeah, we're having dinner. And I think that's probably literally as much consultation the thing. And I don't think that Kathy Kennedy goes into a board meeting on Monday and says, I talked to George. He says, Jedi, blah, blah, this, blah, blah, blah. I think she's probably, the truth is like she's got almost 40 years of high level experience making movies. I don't even know if she has to, she would consult him, for that kind of stuff. Cause really if you really look at their list, Kathy Kennedy has a way more impressive CV. It's kind of like that thing where it's like, I've worked for, 10, 15 different filmmakers as a producer. And it's like, George is like, yeah, I've owned a bunch of companies and I pretty much work for myself where I never had to take any criticism. So if you look at the litany of her accolades versus his, Disney would be defaulting to her opinion 99 times out of 100, a producer or overall executive producer who can shepherd these things from, inception, can not only shepherd them, she can emulate, styles that she's maybe not even her style, but she knows how to hire the right people. Like, all right, we don't actually have the guy that made Star Wars, but we have, all these other resources and we can kind of get close. I don't think they're at the point where I don't think they're at a point where they ever need to, and this is good or bad. I can't honestly say whether I think they should have had him more intimately involved, or maybe as time goes on, it's not important because let's be honest, George would, near the end of his run of Star Wars, even during the prequel era, he would tend to be very capricious in things that he would say like, oh no, this is very important about this is the important thing you need to understand about Star Wars. And then like 2 weeks later, he'd name one of the characters after Conan O'Brien because he was on the Conan O'Brien show.
Right.
So it's like, I almost think that like Kathy Kennedy would take this a lot more serious than even like George. Eventually he'd just be like, yeah, well, I did, we're going to call this, blah, 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 because, I don't know. I can't think of a good example, but long story short, I honestly don't think that he has any current influence on any aspect of Star Wars. I don't think he's a person,
all right.
So I don't think they're referring to anything he says.
Yeah.
But they're just, like you said, I think they're doing it because the people, if say for instance, this Last Jedi doesn't perform, I mean, it's going to perform. It's a Star Wars movie, and people love that high concept stuff. So it's not going to flop. Trust me. Even if it's a bad movie, it's not going to flop. It's going to make its money back. But if the fans are unhappy with the storytelling, maybe they'll lean back more on the idea of like, whoa, we talked to George and he was all right with it. But I think going forward that it's more of a situation where they want to use the fact that, we do consult him as an idea of like what we're making is Star Wars, because we do occasionally dip back in and talk to George. But I think that's just optics. I don't think it's a real thing. I guess I just made that point like 5 times, but.
Well, I think that's a good point to jump into our kind of broader discussion, which is, what do you think about where Star Wars is now compared to, where it was April of 2015, or even, right when Lucasfilm got sold to Disney? To me, and we talked a little bit about this last week, I think, and it just feels, and we've talked about it in bits and pieces this week. I mean, it just feels like there's a lack of risk taking that's going on across most media. Like, I would say the one Star Wars property that's taking the most risks right now was Rebels. Even with, bringing back an established character in Thrawn on, and ultimately, being an animated show on the Disney Channel, the way that they kind of have been treating the Force and introducing the Bendu character and kind of fleshing out, what the Empire, like training facilities and indoctrination facilities for children look like, and bringing back Maul, but even that was, dealing with these holocrons and these like ancient Sith temples and all that. I feel like they're kind of pushing the boundaries of what a Star Wars story could be, a lot more than certainly the movies at this point, but also even the books and the comics, which seems odd because you would think the comics and the books, in what is now the Legends era, obviously there weren't movies or TV shows going on then, but that was kind of where, at least the books, that was where a lot of that was happening. And now the book seems so kind of confined, and okay, we're going to take this character who showed up on this TV show, or we're going to take this character who was in the movie, and we're going to write a novel about them, but it's only going to give you the backstory of that character and show you where they ended up, at the beginning of the movie where you saw them. And, we're not really going to, expand kind of the universe much further than that. So, it's a little disappointing, but it's completely understandable, if you recognize like, okay, again, this is a multi-billion-dollar company. They're in this to, make money. They're not going to put out something that completely fails. And even, I mean, the signs were there from the very beginning when they announced these, standalone anthology movies, when they said, okay, the first three we're going to make are Rogue One about stealing the Death Star plans, a Han Solo movie, and a Boba Fett movie, right? Like those aren't, even now hearing about this, okay, well, maybe they are going to make an Obi-Wan movie, and maybe they make a Hutt movie and a Yoda movie, and everyone's complaining like, well, those aren't really original ideas. Lucasfilm kind of told us that they weren't going to, break the mold too much, years ago. So I guess I just wish that there was a little more of that creativity, and I don't want like everything to be Splinter of the Mind's Eye, or the what is that Han Solo trilogy, or that novel with like the Talon Teal and that creature who could like use the Force to hypnotize people. Like I don't necessarily want all that kind of craziness, but just give us something a little bit different, or give us something that doesn't just explain something else that we've already seen. Like that's kind of what I'm wanting these days. And I don't know that is, and I'm not sure. I'll have to go back and read through some of these old rundowns, but I don't know if that's that different from. I don't think that's my position on that has evolved too much. Like certainly I was excited. Oh, we're getting more Star Wars, and maybe this will be weird, or maybe it'll be crazy, or maybe not. And most of it turned out not to be. But yeah, I think there's kind of this lack of desire or willingness to kind of give us stuff that doesn't just explain something else. And that's a little unfortunate, I think. But that I think is also a byproduct of having this connected universe. Is like, well, if everything is connected, then where do you push those connections further and kind of break the web and give us something different?
Yeah, and I agree. It's and I think that there's the back and forth of this kind of issue about like creating something that will be enjoyed for itself, not just a thing like, oh well, I enjoy this because it's just a continuation of this thing I liked in the past, and like actually enjoying it intrinsically on its own. And I feel like in some ways that these 6 movies, which again we don't know what the 6th movie is that Disney has produced, is probably going to be an exercise in nostalgia with a slight moving of the needle just a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
And that maybe by the time that they reboot, they're going to eventually they're just going to do, and it might be in 10 years it might be in 2030 when, then they know that basically a lot of the, the old fans or the people that are kind of like maybe not super jazzed about some of the stuff that Star Wars has been doing in the last few years, they'll either have an option to be like, yeah, I'm not going to continue with this. I'm just going to stick with what I like. And they'd be able to hook like a whole new young, I hate to say it, like kids that would be like grandchildren age of mine or whatever, if I had children. But, it's like that idea of like they're gonna have to reinvent it because they can't. Like, I kind of appreciate the fact that they have they at the end of the day, whenever I get irritated with Star Wars, I have to concede that most times, 90% of the time, they really are very sensitive to old fans. When a lot of other properties would just be like, hey man, you're 45, go get a life. This is for kids. This is Spider-Man, even though I'd say Spider-Man is kind of, they've kept that very much germane to old fans too. But, this constant reinventing of characters. And I feel like for Star Wars to stay viable, and I don't know if I don't even want to use the word fresh because I don't know what that means anymore. I don't know what fresh means because it's just like it could be, but they're going to want to have a Star Wars that's going to grow, and they're going to have to start appealing to people. That's it's what is it? What's 2017? That next thing they're going to have to think ahead and appeal to children that aren't even born yet, because they're thinking they're thinking the next 50 years, and and say in 20 years from now. A lot of this stuff from the original 3 movies, and again, it's this running joke that I'm the only person who pays attention to this joke, but I think it's funny, is that eventually they're going to be like, the original 3 movies aren't canon anymore, it's because they're going to have to, kids will probably like look at it as like kind of the way when you watch The Wizard of Oz now. When I was growing up, The Wizard of Oz, like, even though I thought it was an exciting movie and stuff, there was part of me that was like, yeah, this is kind of crusty and old. This is like this movie came out, before my parents were even born. And you kind of look at it and you go, okay, well, it's hitting me in the right spots, but the aesthetic's weird and there's like these weird things that happen. I can't even think of an example of it's been so long since I've seen it, but like things that were perfectly okay in would it come out in 32 or something like that, or 36, things like perfectly normal then, and now you'd be like, that's not really, either that's not something we see anymore, or it's something not socially acceptable anymore, so they have to change. So, and I feel like that Star Wars right now is kind of caught between this idea of like, well, they still have a viable older fan base that they go out, they buy the books, they buy the toys, they buy the video games, they do the podcasts, and I think they're not ready to say goodbye to those people yet, even though they have been, trying to stay very current with, current trends about things, and have done a lot of, and I think that they're yes, part of it is marketing, but there's nothing wrong with marketing to people when times change. And so I think I think we're kind of caught between that a little bit. Like in some ways, I think one of the, at least for somebody that's been with this for the long haul, you do see this kind of flattening of characters, the flattening of like kind of the idea of what Star Wars wants to deal with. Like for instance, I think I mentioned this last week. It's like, there's pretty, I could be completely wrong when I walk into the movie, but I think that they've pretty much removed any concept of like romance. Like nobody's going to fall in love in these movies anymore. I think it's something that they're just like, well, I mean, not that George did a fantastic job. I mean, for criminy sakes, it was a love triangle that was incestual at the end of the day. So I mean, we have these it's not like I'm holding this up like it's not a Star Wars movie unless there's romance, and then he did Attack of the Clones, and it's like wow. So she falls in love with him after he murders children, and then later on it's like she dies of a broken heart, and it's like, oh, he doesn't know how to do it. And I think Disney was kind of like, well, even, doing romance it's just not going to work, because either we're going to have to go back and be like George and have it be like, oh, this is corny, or we're going to have to embrace, the present, because a lot more people they want things that happen in the real world to be reflected in Star Wars. And then it's like, well, how do we do all that and still tell a story? So like, let's just cut out the romance. We don't have to have that stuff. So it's like, and I feel like in some ways, not because of the romance, but then we do the characters tend to get flattened out, and their personal motivations get kind of like very simply. Like Rey is like, went from I want to know my parents, and I mean, I think that was her whole thing. It's kind of funny how the Jedi thing was almost like she rejected it, and then, well, why did she embrace it? Did she embrace it because Finn was in trouble? Was that when she finally decided to be a Jedi? I mean, again, it's hard to know because they don't talk about motivations. Whereas Luke, even though his motivations are very simplistic, initially, well, no, I mean, it was kind of vengeance on some way, vengeance for the death of his aunt and uncle, a vengeance for him learning he learns the truth about, well, what he perceives to be the truth of his father. So immediately he feels like, well, this is his boon. He needs to take this bigger step into a larger world. Like, say, like Rey, she's not as invested in it. Well, maybe until Han dies, but even then, it's some old man she knew for a week. It's that kind of idea where it's their motivations now, even though they were simplistic originally, they're even more simplistic now. And I can kind of understand why they do that, but for me, it does get to be that thing where if like you start to go and you like really throw a critical eye on what Disney has been doing in the last few years, it's like they really only have like one little pivot point that the characters ever, it's like, it's almost like if they could get away with not ever explaining the motivations of the characters, I think they would be even happier. Because then, you have like Cassian Andor, like, I've been doing this since I was 5. And okay, so I want to hear this thing about, it would have been a great time to find out, like, yeah, I knew my dad, my mom made this fantastic chemical and the Empire came and they shot him or something. They didn't even explain. You just take it like, I've been doing this for a long time. Okay, well, now we're going to learn a little bit more about Cassian. It's like, no, we're not. We're not going to learn anything more about Cassian. Now, you could say, well, we didn't learn a lot about Han Solo. He didn't grow. But I would say Harrison Ford said, that's the whole reason I came back, is to add some growth to Han Solo. I killed him off, but I finally showed you, he became a real person. But
yeah,
I don't know. Maybe I'm ascribing a lot more, putting a lot more, pressure. And like I said, I feel like maybe if I sat down and with a person from Lucasfilm, they'd be like, well, we are flattening out the character, but and we're only doing what George kind of showed us, 40 years ago, is that as time went on, we flattened out the motivations of the characters, and it actually made for a smoother storytelling. When you get into like little tiny micro motivations, then people start to go like, people criticize those. So I think they're trying to maybe break it down to just archetypes again.
Right.
Which is it feels weird, but whatever,
Yeah. Well, yeah, I mean, and that's a good point, especially at the end, is that, on the one hand, you want to craft these like compelling, unique, complex characters in some degree. But on the other hand, like that's not what Star Wars is, right? Like that's not what it was for a long time. And so, even, all this stuff about like, oh, we're, humanizing or, trying to make, Phasma interesting, and because she's the protagonist of this book, but she's a bad guy, and like, how do you do that? It's like, well, ultimately, right, you just need to remember, like, she's a space Nazi. Like, how much of this backstory is really that interesting or that important to understand, like, this character who's just a space Nazi, right? Like, I don't know. It doesn't really it doesn't really strike me as like, yeah, that they're always. I guess I would say it does strike me that they're in some ways caught in that balance of, yeah, like these are archetypes, but at the same time, we need to create content based on all these characters, and these bad guys are always very popular. So how do we create content based on them? While still acknowledging they're bad, but also making them, the heroes in some sense, or at least the protagonists. So, yeah, and I think the way you do that, the way you manage that, right, is by creating new characters and expanding things out and taking these archetypes and putting them in new and different situations and new and different environments, rather than like, well, here's a slightly different character who has no allegiance to the Empire or the Rebellion, right? Like, okay, sure. He's only in it for the money. Yeah, there have been other characters like that. Yeah, I'm talking about the Slicer DJ in The Last Jedi. It's like, yeah, I mean, it could be an interesting character, but that does, as an individual, but that idea is not necessarily new. I don't know where I was going with that, but just responding to your thing. So the one thing I also wanted to talk about is you mentioned earlier that you have a feeling that we're going to that they're going to decide, or they've already decided that you can't really make a Star Wars movie without these big action sequences, these big space battles or ground battles or some combination of the two. One thing that was interesting to me about that is the guy who is developing this Obi-Wan movie, potentially a guy named Stephen Daldry,
right,
who his directing credits are Billy Elliot and The Hours and The Reader and those sorts of movies that are not really big action sequence space battle movies. And so, and if they make a Yoda movie, as they are, talking about, potentially starting to develop, how do you create a Yoda movie with all these big battles in it while still maintaining this idea that, like, well, no one's really heard of Yoda. No one really knows that Yoda's on Dagobah. I guess they never say that no one knows he's on Dagobah, but you would think that if people knew he was on Dagobah, Vader would go to try to, or the Emperor or someone would try to go to take care of that. The more and more kind of existing characters, the further down the list they go, and all these people who are like in hiding, or if they try to bring in new and interesting directors to these things, like eventually they're going to have to let go of, okay, the third act has a space battle and a ground assault and this other thing, and we're weaving them all together. At some point they're going to have to let go of that, I think, if they truly do want someone like Stephen Daldry to develop a script and direct a movie for them, or if they want to make I'm trying to think of someone else they could make a movie with from the original trilogy that they have that's not already on the table. General Reiki movie. I don't know.
They could do a Chewbacca movie, because I guess that's going to fold into the Han Solo movie. But he's 200 years old.
A Mon Mothma movie, right? Yeah. They could make a Mon Mothma movie in theory, like a political thriller. Yeah, you're not going to be able to have a space battle there.
Yeah, the formation of the rebellion or whatever.
Yeah. So I mean, they are, if they're going to keep going down that path, they're going to have to let go of some of that at some point. And so then that becomes the question: is how committed are they? More committed to keeping Star Wars movies out there, or are they more committed to making Star Wars movies in a particular way? Because if they want to insist on one particular way of making Star Wars movies, I don't think that's going to be very sustainable for very long.
Yeah. Well, yeah, I think it's like, well, they in some they've got to be tempted to kind of mix it up a bit. But then again, it's like that thing where is how far do you push something in a direction when it kind of ceases to feel like Star Wars? It's like, well, we're going to start talking about, is an Obi-Wan movie? What is he going to do? He's going to talk about his loneliness. Is he going to fall in love and you know, have you find out like, oh, he's kind of like, you know, I guess they could write a story where like maybe he's decided like, well, nobody's shown up for Luke for years. I'm going to go do something. And then he meets a woman and he has a family, and it's like, wow, this is like really complex. And then it's like this thing is like, oh, maybe I need to go back to Tatooine and check on Luke, but I have this family now. I mean, that kind of stuff could be interesting, but would that stuff really feel like Star Wars? When this guy has done very like sensitive dramas and stuff is like looking at an Obi-Wan movie, you can't help but think like he wants to probably, unless this guy's like, all I've wanted to do on my entire career is make one popcorn movie, and this is a perfect chance for me to do it.
Right.
And I want to break out and do something different to show people like, hey, I can do an action movie too. They don't all have to be dramas.
Yeah.
It could be like
that's
that.
entirely possible.
Or it could be a thing where, you know, I don't know, because that's why they hired the Lord and Miller to do Han Solo, and it was kind of like, well, they're known for comedy. And then I thought to themselves, well, maybe they want to show that they can do more than that. Well, obviously they didn't. They hired a comedy-based directors, and they started making a comedy-type Star Wars movie, and like Lucasfilm freaked out. I'm like, well, I don't understand. That's what the kind of movies they make. Right. At some point, you had to have had a conversation. They're like, yeah, we're really thinking a very, very light tone, and we're going to do a lot. We love to do, you know, we got Donald, and we worked with him, and, you know, and stuff. We need to do, well, actually, I guess they never did they didn't work on Community, but, you know, Donald Glover, he does improv, and it's like this, you know, that kind of, we're going to do a lot of, Woody Harrelson likes improv. We're going to improv. I mean, I can't imagine they didn't have this conversation. But, you know, it's, well, this other guy, which I don't think I've ever seen Billy Elliot. I know this, I kind of know the story. I've never seen The Hours. So I've never seen any of this man's work. But, you know, if you take it on face value, it's like he would want to make something kind of dark. You know, it's kind of drama, gravitas. And it's like to be like, well, is that the, you know, people at Lucasfilm should be asking themselves, like, well, is that the story we want to tell? You know, or is this an experiment? Right. Is this a proof of concept that we can add more emotional heft to Star Wars films? And, you know, does that mean they're going to start skewing them for older adults? Which I don't think they're going to, you know, especially at the clip of, you know, eventually you start making an Obi-Wan movie and it's PG-13 bordering on R because of things, and all of a sudden you're like, well, okay, how many kids are actually going to want to buy the toys, the pillowcases? You know, we're leaving a lot of we're leaving a lot of money on the table in an attempt to create like an emotionally resonant Star Wars film, when it's like, you don't need to do that much to make Star Wars fans happy, and you could spend a lot of money and effort making a movie that's not Star Wars with this guy. I wonder what their concept is, or what kind of idea that they're kicking around. I know Jonathan Jackson Miller had kind of his Clint Eastwood Western style thing in Kenobi, which is now considered Legends. Yeah. Now, that's not to say that they be like, well, we've already made that book, we can't do that. That might be it might be like something very much akin to Unforgiven or something about, you know, he goes out for one last mission while, you know, Luke obviously is fine, or God forbid Luke's actually, a child Luke is going to be a part of this movie. I really hope not, but it's like, I feel like they're just in a really interesting thing where they're caught between kind of like, yes sir, may I have another, and we really need to think about this, where we're going with this stuff, because we might just be like, you know, we might be killing off Star Wars because we spent too much time trying to please a bunch of 40-year-olds, you know?
Right. I mean, this is, someone could maybe write like a very hackneyed piece about the fact that you have, you know, with the story group and these directors, you have a lot of Generation X folks making Star Wars now. And of course, you know, back when, I don't need to tell you, you know, back when in the like early 90s, when people talked about Generation X, it was like, oh, they love nostalgia, and, you know, you would see like Generation Xers, talk about they love 70s cartoon shows and all that kind of stuff. And so maybe there was a connection between that and then now making these Star Wars movies and making them so, not deviating from the original. Again, that would be a very hackneyed piece to write, and I don't think I even explained it very clearly here. But so I mean, so those are the movies. But how about the like the books and the comics and all of the other media that are out there? I mean, how do you feel about where Star Wars is as like a overall media empire and the books that are coming out and the comics and everything like that?
I mean, I think the books are going to do well, but I would say going forward, now that I don't have homework, I don't feel every time a new book comes out, I always thought to myself, well, I should read it for the show, but very rarely did I ever, except for Bloodlines, which I would say that was probably the one I enjoyed the most out of what I've read.
Mm-hmm.
It's like, but again, it didn't, it was because I was so hungry to find out what had happened in that span of 30 years that I was, and it was because they were using, for most of the time, Leia was first and foremost up front as a main character in her own book, which I was happy with.
Mm-hmm.
But, unlike Thrawn, where you get in there and it's like he felt like he was narrating his own book. But,
right.
I think it'll do fine. I think me personally, as far as how I'm going to, be consuming Star Wars, I won't be reading the Phasma book. I'm going to probably try to keep up on comics, but I probably may wait for the trades. It's not going to be a monthly thing, mainly because I'm kind of, now that this, once the, because I had kind of, with this show is like, and I know we don't like to talk really about behind the scenes, I had always thought eventually we would have to kind of become more direct spoilery just to kind of have interesting things to talk about. And also, as there's more and more movies, there's no way to say it that they're going to become less special. So therefore, spoiling stuff really wouldn't bother me as much. But now that we're not, I don't have to worry about it, I'm actually kind of reversing my feelings on this. And I might be taking the Mark Hamill, Ryan Johnson challenge, and I'm going to pull back and stop reading news. And not really trying to engage. I mean, the toy stuff's, I like the toy stuff. I enjoy that kind of stuff. So eventually, it'll be spoiled through toys and reading on those. But yeah, generally it's like, I kind of started de-bookmarking all my news sites that I went to, because I'm going to try to maybe go in a little ignorant of what's going on. But then again, if the minute that final trailer comes out, I'm gonna be right there to watch it. It's like, because I don't think I don't think I can resist a taste, mainly. And I think I talked about this a little last week. I'm a little kind of like, I'm not super excited about The Last Jedi, only because I feel like they haven't impressed upon me yet why all this change is good. But then again, like what you were saying about a hackneyed article about Generation X, I can't sit here and with a straight face go, no, that's a complete mischaracterization of, because it's like, I definitely am, nostalgia has been a real problem for me, the way I consume art and content. It's like, I think that maybe if we was going to criticize Generation, we definitely are have one foot in nostalgia, one foot in the past whenever something comes up. I'm when things get too far out from from their core, I'm probably the first one to kind of start to go, hey, put the brakes on, especially Star Wars. I don't feel that way about any other franchise. Marvel, they can do whatever they want. You know what I mean? And I feel like even with Star Trek, as much as I love Star Trek, and I could have done a whole parallel show about Star Trek at certain points, I kind of feel like there's something about Star Trek, you can kind of do whatever you want. I don't know why I don't feel that way about Star Wars. Like, when it does start to kind of push, but then again, I'll still, you could probably hand me tapes of me saying they really need to think of the future, but then at the same time I have one foot in the past. And so as far as all the ancillary material, I feel, and this is kind of getting back to the main point, again, the comic books bug me a little bit. The books bug me a little bit because I feel that they are purposely, showing as little growth as possible in the fact that they're not essential to any understanding of the movies. And the adaptions, I don't even bother with them because there's no extra scenes. It's not like there's no fun to it. It's not like picking up the old Marvel adaptation of A New Hope or Empire Strikes Back and finding out like, oh, well, between the time they drew this and the time they made the movie, this scene got 86'd or it got changed and they couldn't change it in time. Now it feels like, oh, they're just doing a visual, an artistic representation of the movie. And that doesn't really offer me a lot of enticement. So with the books, I don't feel like again, you were saying how like, instead of giving us, an origin story, we're really just getting, well, how did they get up to the scene where you see them? Well, that's not interesting to me. In Phasma, again, that's a really, in my estimation, a really terrible character to glom onto and write a book about. It's kind of like, I think they would have been better off not even doing one, and just being like, or, maybe it's like a thing about maybe if they could actually explain like why Hux. Now I know that Hux has got a father that was involved in the First Order, so he's kind of a legacy. This thing where, again, I'm reviewing a book I haven't even read, but everything tells me that they're not really going to explain anything. And if they do, it's not going to be essential to understanding the character. I think it's just a way of their kind of writing their way out of the problem of, hey, Gwendolyn Christie was all over the press and you had her out there and they had those figures out there and then she has like 4 lines and she doesn't even fight. She just walks around a lot. And I think this is their attempt to try to fix that, and hopefully the movie will fix that, because that's really the only place where it counts. It's like you can't fix a problem in the movie by writing a book about it. If the character doesn't pop, it's kind of like, well, it's not like they, after the Phantom Menace, they all of a sudden like said, let's do a Captain Panaka book. And like explain all why he's why he's so negative all the time or something. Yeah. Like I said, I won't be reading that book. I'm not, unless people tell me like, oh my God, this is the Star Wars book I've been waiting for, which I'm be really surprised if it is. I'm probably not gonna, seek that out. I'm probably just gonna try to go into the movie, having seen the trailer or whatever,
Yeah. I mean, I'm probably going to do the same and try to tone down my consumption of news and rumors about the movies, just because, I want to go in a little fresher to these things. And now that I'm free to chat with you or anyone else about it at my leisure, I can be a little more selective of what I know and what I can talk about. With the books and comics, I agree. They feel very kind of boxed in to me, like whether this is Lucasfilm's doing or whether this is, Marvel and is it, I guess Del Rey, is that who published? I don't remember who publishes Star Wars now books, but Del Rey. The fact that the book industry and the comics industry have changed so much, it is maybe restricting what Marvel, agrees to do or suggests to do also. We've gotten, and granted, these things move a lot slower than they feel when you're doing a mostly weekly show, right? Or even that if you're, blogging and creating web, YouTube videos and podcasts about these things like every 4 days about, whatever the latest news and rumors are, in reality, these things move a lot slower. And to that point, we talked about how on our very first show, April 2014, we talked about, the teaser for The Force Awakens is out and they just announced this Rogue One movie. And, here we are 28 months later, and those are still the only 2 movies that have actually been out in theaters. thus far. So, the reality is when you track this news very, very closely, it can feel like, oh, okay, they announced this thing, and then here's a little more news and rumors. We're hearing a little more information about this book, and then the book comes out, and here are the reviews of this book, and when these things take a while to go through the process, and so for the books and comics, maybe I'm being a little unfair, maybe I'm being a little bit of a harsh grader for them, because really it only has been a few years since Marvel got control over these things again. And, in pursuing a multi-year strategy, potentially, they could still just be in phase one of this thing to borrow from Marvel. Who knows? Maybe they do have more exciting and more creatively adventurous things planned in the future, right? And maybe, I'm one of those people who is kind of studiously ignoring any and all things about Snoke because I think it's gotten overblown. But maybe there is something like crazily new and different about Snoke that will, change our tune about how far they're pushing the boundaries. Or, who knows what will happen in Episode 9. Maybe they will turn around and say, we're going to make a Mace Windu movie about, him as a young man, and it's going to be this crazy, like Predator, but with Mace Windu, something like that, where you go, oh, okay, that's not what I expected. So there honestly, there is kind of still time for them to move in that direction. But even having acknowledged that, with the comics, they haven't, there aren't really a lot of new characters that they've introduced. And the new characters that they've introduced are basically just there to, service the story. The exceptions, of course, being Aphra and the evil droids, and to a slightly lesser extent, the evil Wookiee Black Chrysanthemum. And then I get, Sana Staros, they're sort of trying to develop a little more. I think, she just got essentially a standalone issue of Star Wars devoted all to herself. But in that issue, she does what she does, but she's like she never faces any challenges. There's no like narrative tension. Will she be able to pull this off? Like, she just pulls this thing off. And, Lando's there going like, wow, I can't believe you're really getting this done. And she's like, yeah, I am. And there's never any doubt that it's going to happen. So there's not a lot of room for character development when you do that. Aphra, the most recent storyline of Aphra is that she has, the consciousness of the old Jedi trapped in this crystal or jewel or whatever it is, and she's going to auction it off. And so there's this big fancy, costume ball where, she's auctioning this thing, and it's this private auction, and no one's really supposed to know who she is, but of course they do. And, havoc gets wreaked. The thing goes awry, in part because the evil, I guess, if you haven't read these comics, this is going to spoil it, but they've been out for a few weeks, so catch up. Okay. People are busy, but I feel less bad spoiling it. That is to say that the evil droids basically get bored, and they start, trying to kill people. And also they get worried that Aphra is just going to shut them down once this auction is over. And so they call Vader in. And so Vader shows up. And so now, obviously Vader, well, obviously, but from their previous encounter, Vader either expects Aphra to be dead or expects her to keep her head down and pretend to be dead. And she's clearly not doing that. So there's this question then of we haven't gotten this far in the story. Basically, Vader shows up right at the end of the last issue of the storyline. So how is that going to play out? And especially when you have, within the story, the droids being afraid that Aphra's going to shut them down. Maybe she will, and then is that, what happens to them? But then, in a meta sense, the writer Jason Aaron, who's been writing Aphra, is moving over to write the Star Wars title. He's going to be leaving Aphra to write the Star Wars title. He created the character when he wrote the first of the new Darth Vader comics. And so, with Vader showing up, it's kind of moving towards possibly like maybe this is the end of the Afra comic. Not that I know or expect that they'll kill her off. I generally don't know what that character's fate is going to be, but it's conceivable that before the end of the year, Marvel and or Lucasfilm announces, we had a great run. People love this character. The fact that there is even a Dr. Aphra her own comic, is a testament to the fans and the fan reaction to this character. But, story-wise, we think this is a good time to end this run and, move on to other characters and other stories. She may pop up from time to time. Maybe they have something in the works for her, already. Who knows? But I really do wonder if, the storyline is going to be the last storyline for the Afra comic. And that would be in keeping with what they did with the Kanan comic, where, it was created as an ongoing comic, and then it lasted for essentially 2 storylines, I think 14 issues, right? That they did the first storyline, then they did the second storyline, and then they said, well, you know what, this is going to be the last one, and then we're ending this comic. And with that Darth Vader comic that Jason Aaron wrote, at a certain point, they came out and said, yeah, this storyline is going to be the last one because, we did this big crossover event, Vader down, and then we realized, well, we're actually closer to the end of this story than we thought we would be. So it's possible that with Aphra and the Screaming Citadel crossover, that the same thing happened, right? That they had her interact with all the rebels. She comes out of it with this, Ruhr consciousness thing, and they realize, oh, this is actually closer to the end of what we had envisioned for her than we thought. Again, they haven't announced anything. This is just my guess, but given the way everything's shaking out, it's certainly possible. I think that this is the last few issues will be, the last few issues of the Afra comic, for a good long time. So. But then what do you do with that character, right? Unless they have something in the works, you're basically taking your one new breakout character. I guess you could say, Phasma is kind of a breakout character, but at least a character that only exists in the comics, right? There's not been an actress who has portrayed this character in the movies or anything. Became really one of the big breakout new characters in this era. And you kind of give her, her run in Darth Vader, and then she gets, 14 issues of a comic, and then what do you do with her, right? And so it's not that they're not creating new characters, but it doesn't seem like they're creating new characters that are really enduring for very long. Is how I'm viewing this.
Yeah, I think that's a good observation. I think it's kind of funny, dude, because it's almost like they didn't expect people to be into Afra.
Mm-hmm.
And it's like, no, there's kind of a almost, such an opportunity with her where it's like they can, at first I was kind of like, really? Are they just going to have like a squeaky kid? Like this is going to be kind of like she's the anti-Ahsoka. Vader keeps on having these weird relationships with young women where it's like, I'm kind of your mentor now or something. But it's like, it kind of grew on me because it kind of reminded me like the humor of it and the fun. It kind of reminded me like, okay, well, this is kind of like what Star Wars was before. There was like, 8 billion stories out there. It's kind of like there was a kind of levity and there was a kind of almost, it was the 70s and it's kind of like, parody and, being self-aware and all this stuff was kind of, that was an aspect that has kind of gone by the wayside as people get more and more like, concerned with canon, even though I think that they're, they definitely are still in thinking about that with Afra. But the problem is like they keep, like, I feel like in the end, like Screaming Citadel was kind of a missed opportunity, although there was some good stuff in there. But it was like that kind of like, that really should have been maybe just like her and Luke or something. Like if they wanted to bring someone on for the main title, it was like that thing where it's like, oh, we're gonna bring the whole crew in, but then I don't know. It's just like the story didn't quite gel. But again, I don't feel like she needs to be involved with the core characters so much. Like, we've already established that. That's great. That's awesome. They can refer back to it. But like, why not make it fun? Like the Han Solo books, the Brian Daley's, and the L. Neil Smith Lando books. Like, you know, bring the corporate authority back. You know, have that exist in this thing. Like, oh, they end up, you know, hyperspace goes awry and they get shot to another sector of the galaxy where people don't go, and there's like the corporate sector. You know, it could have been a fun expansion and have like a really good high adventure sci-fi comic with, you know, with a Star Wars aesthetic. I mean, you could even do some goofy things, what I'm not a fan of, but if you did it right, I would give it a fair shake. Hell, you could cross it with the Guardians of the Galaxy. I know people don't scream if you're listening to this, and I've done a faux pas, but I mean, it's comic books, you know, it's not Star Wars, big S Star Wars, big SW Star Wars. It's comic books, and they can they can try different things. And if we go, oh, that sucked, guess what? You just kind of forget about it. It doesn't hurt as bad as it being like, you know, watching a movie and they spend hundreds of millions of dollars and then it misses the mark. This is a comic book. It's like you said, you can experiment, you can push the edge. It just seems, it's a shame that they take this character and like you're saying, inevitably it feels like it's moving towards a conclusion, even if they haven't announced it.
Yeah.
Because they're already doing that thing where it's like, oh, in the second season of some show, the ratings were bad, so we had a guest star, you know, like Archie Bunker comes on to, you know, the Jeffersons or vice versa. You know, like they're just kind of like having guest stars, and, you know, it almost makes you, the only weird thing, it makes you feel like the main Star Wars title is floundering too. Where it's like, okay, well, she's coming to an end, so now she's guesting on Star Wars, and she's kind of taking over, so she's not, like, the main characters aren't even the own focus of their book. And then you go back to Afra, and it feels like it's a little stymied when you have this entire galaxy universe you can explore, and they're just kind of like, well, we're running afoul of the Empire again. It's like, well, you could do a lot of stuff, and you definitely don't have to have it be like, you know, you could have like little things like, oh, she's rummaging through a Sith temple and she takes a holocron and then she goes to sell it to somebody. And then the Empire is after her again. And then she gets, you know, I feel like one of the big problems is like, because they want to keep the lid on so much stuff in the movies that they just, everything else suffers. Like they feel like they can't expand because they're like, oh, we're going to explain something and then we're going to box in one of the movie writers. And it's like, maybe they should, this is why you should have kept these things. Like, I bet you anything Irvin Kershner never looked, or Lawrence Kasdan more appropriately, never cracked open a Marvel Star Wars comic while he was polishing up the Empire script. And goes, oh, I can't do that. You know, they already did that in this comic. Archie Goodwin already did this 2 years ago. We can't have, you know, this happen. You know, they were separate entities. And I feel like it would only behoove Marvel to stop thinking about, like, we need to be connected to what Dave Filoni's doing or what Kathy Kennedy's doing over at Lucasfilm. It's like, I think it should be fun first, canon second, you know?
Yeah.
But they're not.
Yeah.
They're not gonna do it.
And that's, I think, I think that might be a change for me, right? Because, and there is such a thing as going too far afield, and you know, by the end of what is now the Legend eras, or maybe not even by the end, but you know, there were certainly periods of what is now the Legends era where they went too far afield, and it just, you know, both at the time and in retrospect, it just doesn't work, and the quality kind of suffered a little bit. In trying to like mash too many things together. But yeah, I think I'm with you that I'm the opinion of, not a lot of this has that kind of fun feeling to it anymore. And the stuff that does feel a little fun, it's like, well, but we can't do too much of that because, we need to make sure that, Lawrence Kasdan is happy, or we need to make sure that Simon Kinberg, his script for a movie that won't go into production for 2 more years at least and won't see the light of day for 6 more years. Like, we need to make sure that movie is respected and we are not stepping on anyone's toes there. And so I think there can be almost too much of that connection and too much of that, kind of shared universe, shared storyline idea where, just go make something that you want to make.
Well,
Yeah.
Sorry.
Go ahead.
And I feel that's, I mean, with Filoni, I feel like in some ways Rebels has been stymied by that. And considering, like, people some people say, I enjoy Rebels almost as much as the movie. Some people say even more so. I would never say that myself, but, again, it suffers. It's like, I feel like, I don't think that they waste a lot of time, like, trying to make sure they don't contradict comic books or anything, but it's like that whole thing where I felt like I spent months looking forward to this Obi-Wan Darth Maul confrontation, and it was such a non-thing. Yeah. It was such a, it was like, okay, I'm not even talking about the battle. I mean, it's perfectly fine that okay, he's so good. Obi-Wan at this point, he's so one with the Force, he can just take him down in 2 moves. That's perfectly fine. This isn't me just going like, I wanted a longer battle. I just wanted something to happen. I wanted, Maul to, grow. I honestly felt like, again, I think I said this in the show, I still think Maul should have realized his thing, and that was like the ultimate growth of Maul, as he took his, he should have taken his lightsaber, tossed it into the fire, got in his ship, and left. And people never know what happened to Darth Maul. Like, he could show up, 10 years from now in a TV show or whatever, and it could just be like, what kind of thing. I think that could have been fun, but instead they dispatched him, with a lot of build up and not a lot of payoff, and I think that's part of the problem with that kind of thing. We're like, well, we're going to introduce Saw Gerrera, but it's kind of like we don't quite get that. We don't really get enough about Saw where we really understood, like, okay, well, that really informed my understanding of Rogue One. And I feel like, and then I think the rumor is that they're going to come back and bring him back in again. It's like, okay, so they're going to try it again in a couple months, and then it's just going to be, what is it going to be? This thing is going to go on at the last minute. He's going to get an argument with somebody and go, I'm going to go start my own thing later. It's like, oh, well, there's not a lot of growth there. I don't know. I feel like in some ways the movies kind of, pilfer a lot of the weight out of the cartoons, and maybe that's, and partly because it is supposed to be initially. I mean, it was supposed to be for kids, but then it's like I hear a lot more grown-ups or teenagers of that age watching this stuff than say like I don't hear anybody go like, my 6-year-old just can't wait till the newest episode of Rebels, because some of this stuff can be pretty dark. So in some ways they box themselves into a corner with that. But I don't know. I haven't really been keeping up on any of the talk of this 4th season, which is the last, correct?
Yes, correct.
Yeah, so I mean, maybe Filoni with the gloves off and going like, hey, I've like 20 episodes, or was he doing 13 or something this time around? I can't remember. Oh, I don't
I might
be confusing that with Game of Thrones. But, I know it's all just mishmashed in my head. But, just this idea of like, well, the gloves are off and I can kind of do whatever I want with these characters within reason. But then again, he's still playing these games with like, oh, Ahsoka's still alive. And it's like, oh,
yeah, I know.
Jeez. To me, that feels very like, I know that makes sense because they didn't. Anytime they don't show somebody die on screen, that to me that's them telegraphing, oh, the character's not really dead. But
Right.
it's kind of like, okay, so this is going to be a lot of like bait and switch with you this season. It's kind of like, it's going to build up, you're going to be so, and it's like, usually they push the needle forward in the first 5 minutes, and then it's a lot of, it's a lot of Chopper arguing with Zeb over who gets the best seat on the Ghost or something, I don't know.
Right.
Again,
so technically season 4 of Rebels is going to be 16 episodes, but of course the way they've usually done it is 2 of those episodes are combined into the season premiere, and then another 2 are combined into the season finale. So it'll probably end up being 13 episodes, but 2 of those episodes will be 44 minutes long.
Okay, so I was kind of right. I mean, whatever. I definitely
14 episodes. Yeah,
I'm definitely gonna keep up with that with Rebels.
Yeah. No, and so I guess this is also a good time to talk about what else. I mean, projecting out in the future. What do you think the future holds for Star Wars here?
Like in the immediate future?
No, just in general. Like, where do you think it's going? About what we think of where it is today and what they're doing these days. I mean, do you think they're going to keep this kind of safe, direction? Do you think they'll ever branch out into something? Do you think, obviously with Rebels ending, Filoni, may have time to develop another show, but he also kind of took a step up. Do you think he still, do you think he'll direct another show, or do you think, he's kind of taking on a more mentorship role? Do you think, the comics will be different at some point? Do you think the books do you think we'll ever get another, I mean, I'm sure we will, but, what do you think is out there to develop a trilogy of books, which were so common in, or even a multi-novel, long spanning storyline in these books? Like, what do you think the future holds for Star Wars?
Well, I mean, I think there's definitely going to be a lot of, I don't know for sure what it thinks. I mean, I have my own opinions about going forward, that they are going to have to keep one ear to the ground, and they're going to have to, adjust as time goes, because I feel like, again, I'm repeating myself, but it's like, eventually people, like my age, are going to start dying off. I mean, I hate to say that, but it's like, I'm full well aware that, like, what I like about Star Wars is not necessarily going to be catered to. I mean, it's already, a lot of it is I'm having to adjust my expectations, from 2-3 years ago, what I thought like, I just assumed, like, oh, they're going to buy Star Wars and they'll probably just kind of keep doing it the way they were doing it before. But no, it's really has changed. I mean, as far as like the structure of stuff, I think it's going to be, I think it's going to be more of a kind of a workshop kind of idea of making product, in the sense that they, this guy that might be doing the Obi-Wan film notwithstanding, is I think they're just going to hire, like, who they hire to do these movies is going to become less and less important. I don't think they're going to promote it as much. I think that they, they're just going to try to, maybe they'll do it in the, make casting more important. Maybe they'll try to go towards more established actors instead of casting a lot of unknowns, which will be weird, but they're already kind of moving that, with the Han Solo movie. There's so many actors that are kind of well known before they, even Michael K. Williams, he's definitely not an unknown actor, and they brought him in for what it might amount to a rather small role. So yeah, I mean, I think eventually, I get the feeling that, like, there's going to be some changes once this trilogy is done. I think there'll be some big changes in Lucasfilm. I still think Kathy Kennedy will probably end up becoming the CEO. She'll be taking Bob Iger's job at Disney eventually. I think that in some ways, this was, because she'd never ran. She definitely was. I forget what her and Frank Marshall's company is called, her husband's production company, but I mean, I don't. She never ran the corporation, and now she's run the corporation. She's weathered the storm. You know, she's made the hard decisions, like anybody coming up in the corporate. And I think in some ways this job was like George Lucas said, there was nobody that knew this better than her to shepherd for this change. But as time, I think this kind of putting out fires and the stuff that she might be like, you know, okay, I've done it. I've proved that I do think it's like I'd rather be more of a broad stroke person. Now I don't know anything about her as a person, so I could be completely wrong. It might be a thing where she's like, no, I've wanted to be, you know, president of Lucasfilm my entire career, and I'm going to stay there until they have to take the, you know, reins from my hands.
Right.
But I don't think it would hurt Disney to have somebody, you know, that has literally, she'd be coming right out of the trenches because she's having to make these hard decisions. She's having to fire directors and tell people like, no, you're fired. We're rewriting this script. Or what do you do when your beloved character dies and, you know, you're like, well, you can't just CGI him. It's not like, you know, there's sensitivities. And I feel like, you know, going forward, so maybe a guy like, you know, I don't know what, you know, maybe Filoni will end up running Lucasfilm someday, which, you know, may be good or bad. I don't know. Maybe that's not even his thing. Cause I always thought Filoni would eventually, like, I kept thinking like, you know, and I don't think this came up when Lord and Miller got fired. I thought to myself like, well, maybe if they weren't in production with Rebels, I wonder if Filoni, you know, cause you know that maybe on some level he's got to be like, I want to make a live action Star Wars film. And
possibly,
maybe not, you know, I don't, like I said, I haven't watched a lot of interviews. Maybe he's like, no, I totally love animation is my jam. And that's the palette I think from. I could be completely wrong. I see, my personal bias is I always consider animation to be inferior to live action. And I don't know why, cause it's like, there's some amazing animated films out there. I've always kind of considered that to be a kind of like lesser, but yeah, I know.
No, I mean, you're not alone there,
but yeah, no, I mean, the Star Wars has got, you know, I think they're going to be fine because again, they're spending, you know, however it's cost to make these 2 parks in the Disney properties. They're going to be making a hotel. I mean, this is something that they're definitely, they're not just going to one day go, well, we're going in this direction and, you know, see you later if you can't deal with it. I think they're going to try to engage as many fans and in as many different demographics for as long as possible before it just doesn't make sense anymore, you know, before you kind of just age out of it or whatever. Because it's like, you know, again, with fans like me, the old fans or whatever, you know, maybe they don't have to market the books to us as much as they used to. And, you know, I mean, they can just do it slowly, like a process. Like, they probably want to, like, oh, no, you know, a lot of people are kind of the young adults. So, like, I have noticed, like, the books, they tend to skew more of a young adult, which is kind of crazy when they end up doing specifically young adult books because they're, like, they feel even more...
for children.
Yeah, I feel even more childish than like say like, oh, these are for 13-year-olds. I'm like, really? I think these are more for 7-year-olds kind of thing. But you know, I mean, what's your take? What do you think?
You know, I think after episode 9, my guess would be that's probably the last we'll see Daisy Ridley and whoever is in that movie, whoever survives that movie. I think that's probably the last movie they'll do for a while. That's not to say they won't do another trilogy, but I think, you know, they could do another time jump and you know, pick the story up in the future, which would then give them a lot of room in intermediate time to fill in with, you know, books and comics and everything else. I think, you know, maybe they decide that this actually turned out to be a relatively successful model. You know, having these movies set several decades after the original trilogy. But I do wonder if we'll see, you know, those characters, whichever characters survive episode 9, I think, you know, a series of novels, be they young adult novels or otherwise, about kind of what happens next. I think they'll probably, we'll at least get one. We'll probably maybe get a trilogy. We may get a trilogy. We may, but I think I think they also maybe conceive of a longer story arc for the post episode 9 universe. And that's where they figure out, okay, so what's the government now, and who's in charge and all that kind of stuff. With regard to the TV shows and comics and just generally, sorry, I'll let you jump in. I think, I kind of have to hope or I have to assume that they will be getting more creative and start pushing the boundaries, because if I don't, and if I just think like, well, everything's going to be roughly the same as it is, for the foreseeable future, that's kind of depressing to me. That's kind of a bummer to think about Star Wars in that way, for me. Kathleen Kennedy's future, I don't know. The thing that gets me is, I think everyone kind of is anticipating that Bob Iger is going to step down. I've started seeing recently some stuff saying that he might run for president, which is crazy. But whether she, you have multiple candidates to take over for Disney, whether she wants to or not. Obviously, it would be, getting her name out there. It's you make it as the head of Disney, but she may also decide, it's not that she wants to be head of Lucasfilm forever, but she may decide like, oh, being the head of Disney, I have to deal with all this stuff I don't want to. Who knows?
Exactly.
So yeah, I don't know. I'm less interested in that. Who would replace her? I think there's some obvious candidates to replace her. Kiri Hart would probably be my guess.
Yeah, now that I said that, I realized, like, yeah, probably not Filoni.
I think Filoni would be an option, and obviously it would depend on whether Kiri Hart wants to take on more production duties and having to deal with like, okay, I have to be the one to fire this director who's not doing what I want. I have to hope again that they'll start bringing in more diverse writers and directors for their movies and even authors for their books. I think they have some diversity in the writers for their books, but not a lot. Just because they've talked about it, they've talked about bringing in more diverse writers and directors and how they're looking at it and they want to do it, and then okay, the guy who made The Hours and Stephen Daldry and Billy Elliot is who you're looking at to make this Obi-Wan movie, right? Like what they say and what we're getting don't always match up in that regard. So again, I have to hope that there's more of that. I have to hope that there's more creativity and boundary pushing, just because otherwise it just seems really boring and bleak to me.
Yeah. I think that's, maybe not with this trilogy, but I think going forward and stuff that this nostalgia is just not gonna get people to that thing anymore, because then you're starting to be like, hey, remember that thing 50 years ago? It's like, no, I don't. So what are you trying to sell me here? It's like, it's going to have it's going to have to reflect the times as the kind of, again, though, I think I talked a long time ago the fact that Star Wars, there's a lot of lip service, especially in like that documentary that came with the DVD set about, Star Wars was a reaction to the kind of the post-Vietnam, post-Watergate, post-Summer of Love kind of, there was kind of a
malaise.
And Star Wars harkened back to a simpler time when, back in the, 30s and stuff, when kids would go to the movies all day on a nickel and, and so really in some ways Star Wars is still ruminating in something that's not just 40 years old. It's like, technically it's 80 years old. It's, if you think about it, an aesthetic, and it's how long is that aesthetic going to make sense to people? And it's like, do they want to integrate more, reactions and to real life and what's going on in the world, or is it going to be, escapism? I think they're going to have to figure that out. It's kind of like Marvel has kind of been kind of more try to float on that a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
And now I don't know what their movies. I don't know what the movies are right now of what the storylines. I think maybe they are still kind of trying to stay kind of timeless, but I don't know how long you can do that. Or maybe that's the thing. It's like maybe they'll be able to kind of crack the code of like perfect escapism forever. I don't know. I'm definitely not an expert on these things.
Yeah.
I think we're.
And with that, I think that's a good place to.
I think I've completely
with that acknowledgement.
And that was the last time I ever talked about Star Wars, because I think I've said everything I need to say.
Yep.
Okay, well, in closing, I just want to thank everybody who ever listened to the show and ever sent us an email or used our Amazon link and all that stuff. I appreciate it. I want to thank John for doing this. For really, it's been not just the 2.5 years. It's been since November of 2013 when we started Talking Bird as a goof. We just thought it'd be fun to just do a quick. At least in my head, it was a kind of a parody of the ubiquitous Chris Hardwick's Talking Dead show. I thought, well, what if they did one for a show that was 11 minutes, and that's kind of how we got our start. Yep. And I appreciate you coming along with me on this, and we've done a lot of things in the past, and I'm sure it's probably not the last.
Absolutely. I know this has been super fun, and it's been great chatting with you all these many years.
Cool. Well, for Talking Birdcast, I have been Robert Zachary.
I am still John Llewellyn.
Thanks for listening, and may the Force be with you always.
You've had a lot of fun. A lot of fun. You've had an opportunity to attack me, and I think I've given as good as I've taken. I leave you gentlemen now, and you will now write it, you will interpret it, that's your right. But as I leave you, I want you to know, just think how much you're going to be missing. You don't have
Talking Bird
to kick around anymore.